The sound wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't the crack of a Winchester rifle echoing off the canyon walls, a sound this man had heard thousands of times before. It was something much smaller, much more fragile. It was the sound of glass shattering against a wooden floor. March 28th, 1914, Pikeville, Kentucky. Inside a modest house, the air instantly changed. 1 second, it smelled of stale tobacco and old timber. The next, it was choked with the sharp chemical sting of kerosene. And then came the heat. A heat so sudden and violent, it sucked the oxygen right out of the room. In the center of this inferno stood an old man. He was 88 years old. His hands, once steady enough to aim down the sight of a rifle during the Civil War, were now trembling. His eyes, which had watched his own children die in the mud of the Tugfork River, were now wide with a very different kind of terror. He wasn't on a battlefield. He wasn't pinned down in an ambush. He was in his own home. He was simply trying to light a lamp to push back the darkness of a Saturday evening. But his hand slipped, or perhaps he stumbled. We will never know the exact mechanics of that split second. All we know is that the lamp fell, the oil spilled, and the flame caught. This man was Randolph McCoy, Old Randall, the Patriarch, the legend, the man who had survived the bloodiest feud in American history. He had dodged hundreds of bullets. He had survived the bounty hunters, the night raids, and the execution of his sons. He was the unkillable ghost of the Appalachian mountains. And yet, here he was, not fighting a Hatfield, not fighting a soldier, but fighting a fire that was climbing up his clothes, turning the safe haven of his living room into a trap. It seems almost like a cruel joke written by a bad screenwriter. To survive the war, only to die by the hearth. To outlive the enemies who swore to kill you, only to be taken out by a household accident. But looking at his life, you have to wonder if it was truly an accident. There is an old saying in the mountains, death has a schedule. If you skip your appointment too many times, it doesn't just forget about you, it waits. And when it finally comes back with interest. Some historians look at this night and see a tragic, clumsy fall of a senile old man. Others see something darker, a karmic balance finally settling the score after decades of bloodshed. On one hand, you have the logic of a household accident. On the other, the intuition that a life defined by violence can only end in violence, even if it's just a fire in a quiet room. I'm curious where you stand. When you hear a story like this, do you trust the cold facts of the coroner's report, or does your gut tell you that fate was simply collecting a debt? By 1914, Randolph McCoy had become something of a living museum exhibit. If you walked down the streets of Pikeville that year, you would see the first automobiles sputtering down the dirt roads. You would see electric lights flickering on in storefronts. You would hear people talking about the tension in Europe, about a war brewing across the ocean. The 20th century was arriving with a roar. But Randall was stuck in the amber of the past. At 88 years old, he was a striking, almost biblical figure. Photographs from his later years show a man with a long, flowing white beard, like an Old Testament prophet who had seen too much and said too little. His eyes were deep set, shadowed by heavy brows that seemed permanently furrowed in suspicion. But the body was failing. The legs that had once trekked miles through the Appalachian mud to hunt down stolen pigs or evade ambush were now stiff and slow. The hands that had loaded muskets with terrifying speed now shook when he held a coffee cup. He lived quietly. He spent his days operating a small ferry, moving people across the river, back and forth, a repetitive motion that must have felt like a penance. When he wasn't working, he was sitting, waiting. To the locals, he was a celebrity, but of the tragic kind. Children would whisper when he passed. "That's him," they would say. "That's the McCoy." But they didn't see the warrior. They saw a shell. It is difficult to imagine the silence inside his head. Most of his family was gone. His wife, Sarah, The woman who had stood by him through the absolute worst of the violence had died years earlier. His sons, the ones who were supposed to carry on the name, were buried in the hillside. He was the captain of a ship that had already sunk. He was just the last one floating in the debris. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with outliving your own war. The soldiers you fought with are gone. The enemies you hated are gone, or old men themselves. The reasons you fought, the pigs, the timber rights, the pride, seem insignificant when you are staring at a blank wall in 1914. He carried the weight of the dead with him everywhere. Every creak of the floorboard likely sounded like a footstep. Every shadow in the corner looked like an assassin. You don't just turn off 30 years of hypervigilance because you turned 80. But on that night, as he shuffled around his room, he wasn't thinking about the feud. He was likely thinking about the cold, about the stiffness in his joints. He was a man reduced to the basic necessities of survival. It is easy to pity him in this moment, a frail old man, alone in a room. But do not make the mistake of thinking he was weak. Underneath that withered skin was scar tissue tougher than leather. He had survived things that would have broken lesser men in a week. To understand the fire of 1914, you have to understand the fire of 1888. Because for Randall McCoy, this wasn't the first time that fire had come to kill him. It was New Year's night. The ground was frozen solid, and a thin layer of snow covered the Tugfork Valley, muffling the world in a cold, white silence. Inside the McCoy cabin, what was left of the family was gathered for warmth. The war with the Hatfields had been raging for years, but for a moment, the walls of their home felt like a fortress against the hate. They were wrong. The attack came without warning. It started with the dogs barking frantically into the darkness, and then a sound that didn't belong, the splintering of the cabin door as it was kicked in. What happened next was not a battle, it was a massacre. The cabin, their only sanctuary, was turned into a cage. Gunpowder smoke, thick and acrid, filled the small space, making it impossible to see, impossible to breathe. The world was reduced to flashes of orange light from the rifle muzzles and the deafening thunder of gunshots that made the floorboards vibrate. Randall and his family were trapped. The attackers, led by Jim Vance, a man known for his brutal efficiency, couldn't get a clean shot at them inside. So they used a different weapon. They set the kitchen ablaze. The fire was alive. It crawled up the wooden walls with an unnatural speed. It licked at the ceiling, eating the dry timber of the roof. The heat became unbearable. The smoke became a poison. Randall was faced with an impossible choice: stay inside and suffocate, or run out into a hail of bullets. He watched in horror as the flames consumed everything he owned. He saw the faces of his family illuminated by the very thing that was trying to kill them. In a desperate act, he managed to escape the burning house and hide in the freezing water of the family well. From the bottom of that dark hole, he could only listen. He heard the roar of the fire. He heard the muffled shouts. He heard the final terrible collapse of his home as the roof gave way, sending a shower of embers into the night sky. When he finally climbed out, the shooting had stopped. The attackers were gone. The cabin was a smoldering ruin, a black skeleton against the white snow. He saw his wife Sarah collapsed on the ground, left for dead in the freezing cold. He would soon learn the full cost of the night. 2 of his children were gone. He escaped the flames that night. He thought he had beaten the fire. In his mind, he had faced the worst it could do. He was wrong. That night planted a seed of terror in his soul, a terror of being trapped, of the smell of smoke, of the sound of burning wood, a terror that would lie dormant for 26 years. When the last embers of his home went cold, Randall McCoy was left with an inventory of ghosts. There was Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., his 3 sons, tied to pawpaw trees and executed by a Hatfield firing squad. There was Calvin and Alifair, murdered during the New Year's night massacre, their lives extinguished in the chaos of that burning cabin. The list of the dead was a constant, looping litany in his mind. As the patriarch of a mountain clan, your one sacred duty is to protect your bloodline, to see it grow. And he had failed, spectacularly, publicly. This is the part of the story that the dime novels and the Hollywood movies always get wrong. They portray survival as a victory. But for Randall, survival was a punishment. He was the one left behind to count the graves. Imagine waking up every morning and the first thing you see are the faces of your dead children. Imagine hearing their names whispered on the wind, the phantom smell of gunpowder on a calm summer day, the cold weight of their names in your mouth when you try to pray. What do you do with that? How do you function? After the massacre, the feud slowly died down. The court cases ended. The journalists went home. The world moved on. But for Randall, the war never ended. It simply moved inside. He became a prisoner of his own memories. He became reclusive, paranoid. The feud had taught him that a threat could come from anywhere, at any time. A neighbor, a distant cousin, a shadow in the trees. He had spent so long looking over his shoulder that he forgot how to look forward. His wife, Sarah, was said to have been broken by the ordeal. She never fully recovered from that New Year's night, and the grief she carried was a weight that pulled them both down. When she died, another piece of him died with her. He was left truly alone, the last custodian of a family tragedy. This is the survivor's curse. You don't get to die with your comrades on the battlefield. You have to live with the silence that comes after. You have to endure the quiet, sunny days that feel like an insult to the memory of the violent nights. The old lion was wounded, not by a bullet, but by grief. And so he sought out a life that was simple, repetitive, and quiet. He needed a way to escape the prison of the past, even if it was just for a few hours a day. He found his sanctuary on the water. In a move so full of tragic poetry it feels scripted, Randolph McCoy, the mountain warrior, became a ferryman. He took a job operating a small, flat-bottomed boat, guiding people and their horses from one side of the river to the other. This wasn't just any river. It was the Tug Fork, the very same body of water that served as the border between Kentucky and West Virginia, the border between McCoy and Hatfield territory, the place where so much of the blood had been spilled. Every single day, he would pole his way across the very waters that had claimed his family. Imagine the sight. A foggy morning on the river, the water dark and silent, holding its secrets. Out of the mist comes the silhouette of a boat, and standing on it, a gaunt old man with a flowing white beard, pushing a long pole into the muddy riverbed. It's an image straight out of mythology. In the old Greek stories, the ferryman Charon carries the souls of the dead across the river Styx into the underworld. It is hard to look at old Randall McCoy on his ferry and not see the same thing. He was a man caught between two worlds, the living world he no longer felt a part of, and the world of the dead, where all his sons resided. What must his passengers have thought? To step onto this small, rickety boat and realize that the silent old man guiding them was a living legend. Did they try to talk to him about the feud? Or was there an unspoken agreement to let the past lie? Most likely the journey was made in a heavy silence, the only sounds being the creak of the wood and the gentle lapping of the water against the hull. Back and forth, sunrise to sunset, a simple, repetitive task. But perhaps that's what he needed. The rhythm of the work, the mindless push and pull, might have been the only thing that could quiet the noise in his head. It was a form of meditation, a way to impose a simple, predictable order on a life that had been defined by chaos and unpredictable violence. He was a ghost on the water, forever crossing a line he could never truly leave behind. But from his vantage point on the river, he had a perfect view of the world he was disconnected from. And that world was changing fast. Every time Randall McCoy docked his ferry, he wasn't just stepping onto land. He was stepping into a different century. The Pikeville of 1914 was a town in the middle of a massive transformation. The old quiet of the mountains was being drowned out by new, mechanical noises. The clatter of horse-drawn wagons was now mixed with the sputtering cough and startling backfire of a Ford Model T. For a man who had spent his life listening for the snap of a twig in the forest, the noise must have been a constant, low-grade assault on his senses. At night, the world he knew was supposed to be dark, lit only by the moon and the soft yellow glow of firelight. But now, strange electric lamps were beginning to appear, casting a harsh, sterile white light that chased the shadows into corners he no longer recognized. The very language of the world was changing. People on his ferry weren't talking about land disputes or stolen livestock anymore. They were reading newspapers with headlines about tensions in a place called Serbia, about alliances and armies mobilizing across an ocean he couldn't even imagine. The world was gearing up for the Great War, a conflict of machines and trenches that would make the Hatfield-McCoy feud look like a schoolyard scuffle. His story, once a terrifying present-day reality, was slowly becoming folklore. It was something people told their children, a local legend about a bygone era of mountain justice. He was becoming a myth in his own lifetime. How strange it must have been, to be the central character in a story that everyone thinks is over, while you are still living in the final, unwritten chapter. He was an artifact, a walking, breathing piece of the 19th century, adrift in the roaring current of the 20th. He didn't belong to this new world. He didn't understand it, and he had no desire to. The future was a foreign country. And so, every evening, after a day spent on the timeless river, he would make a retreat. He would leave the noise and the electric lights of Pikeville behind and walk back to a place he understood. A small, quiet house where the only light came from a fire in the hearth and a simple glass lamp. As the sun bled out behind the Kentucky hills, Randall McCoy's world shrank to the four walls of his small house. The day's work was done. The ferry was tied up for the night. Now came the rituals of the evening, a sequence of small, predictable actions that held the chaos of his memories at bay. He wasn't entirely alone. In his final years, his grandson often stayed with him, a quiet presence that filled a fraction of the house's deep silence. They would eat a simple meal, some bread, maybe some salted meat. The conversation was likely sparse. What was there to say? The old man's stories were too heavy for a young boy, and the young boy's world was too fast for the old man. After the meal, the chill of the night would begin to seep through the floorboards. The fire in the hearth would be stoked, its warm orange light painting flickering shadows on the walls. These were the shadows he knew, the ones he could control. Then came the most important ritual of the night, the bringing of the light. In a world before a switch on the wall could flood a room with electricity, light was a precious manufactured thing. It came from a kerosene lamp, a simple device made of a glass font to hold the fuel, a brass collar, and a cloth wick. To us, it's a rustic antique. To him, it was a vital piece of technology, the only tool he had to fight the total, suffocating darkness of the rural night. He would take the lamp. His hands, gnarled with age, would unscrew the cap. He'd check the fuel level, adjust the wick. These were the slow, deliberate movements of a man who has performed the same task every single night for decades. It was a routine he had likely done 10,000 times before. But a routine is just a statistic, and statistics don't care about experience. He would strike a match, the flare of sulfur, a tiny star in the growing darkness. He'd lift the glass chimney, touch the flame to the wick, and watch it catch. A small, steady flame would rise, and as he replaced the chimney, the room would fill with a soft, warm glow. For a moment, all was right. The darkness was held at bay. A small circle of civilization was carved out of the wilderness. But the instrument of its defeat was made of glass, and it was filled with fire. In that soft lamplight, the old fears would begin to stir. Because for a man like Randall McCoy, the darkness outside the window was never truly empty. It was always watching. In that quiet, lamplit room, the past was never far away. It was a constant, low hum beneath the silence, a pressure against the windows. Imagine trying to relax, even for a moment, when you know that a few miles away, across a river, lives the man who orchestrated the destruction of your family. In 1914, William Anderson Hatfield, Devil Anse, was still very much alive. He was old, yes, but he was still the patriarch of the Hatfield clan. He was still the man whose name was synonymous with McCoy's suffering. The war was officially over. The governors of Kentucky and West Virginia had declared a truce. But a truce on paper is not a truce in the heart. For a man like Randall, who had seen peace treaties broken and promises turned to ash, how could he ever truly believe he was safe? Every gust of wind that rattled the window pane, was it just the wind, or was it a footstep? Every dog that barked in the distance, was it chasing a rabbit, or had it sensed a stranger in the woods? This was the psychological prison he had built for himself, or rather, that the Feud had built for him. Decades of looking over his shoulder, of sleeping with a rifle by the bed, had rewired his brain. His nervous system was permanently calibrated for threat. He was like a soldier returned from the trenches, who jumps at the sound of a car backfiring. Except his war had never been in a foreign land. It had been in his own backyard. The enemy had the faces of people he knew, people he might pass on the road. It is likely that on that final night, as he sat in his chair, he wasn't consciously thinking about the Hatfields. But the fear was a part of his biology. It was in the tension in his shoulders, the quickness of his breath, the way his eyes would dart towards the door at any unexpected sound. He had spent his entire life fighting a tangible enemy, a man with a gun, a clan with a grudge. He knew how to fight that. You build a taller fence, you buy a better rifle, you sleep in shifts. But the enemy that was coming for him that night wasn't an army of men. It wasn't human. It didn't have a motive. It didn't have a name. It was sitting right there on the table, glowing innocently, patiently, waiting for a single moment of human error. Let's pause for a moment and talk about the lamp. Because to us, it's a piece of rustic decor. But in 1914, it was a piece of everyday technology. And like all technology, it operated on a set of very strict, very unforgiving rules. A kerosene lamp is, at its core, a controlled fire in a glass bottle. It is a marvel of simplicity. A cloth wick is submerged in a font filled with kerosene. Through a process called capillary action, the wick acts like a straw, drawing the liquid fuel upwards against gravity. When you light the wick, you aren't actually burning the cloth. You are burning the kerosene vapor that is released from the top of the wick as it's heated. The glass chimney around the flame serves two purposes. It protects the flame from drafts, and it creates a convection current, drawing air up from the bottom, which makes the flame burn brighter and cleaner. For all intents and purposes, it is a tiny, bottled sun, a perfectly balanced system of fuel, air, and heat. But here is the critical design flaw. The entire system is predicated on that balance. It is predicated on the integrity of a thin piece of glass. If that glass bottle breaks, the system is no longer in balance. The liquid kerosene, which was being consumed in a controlled manner at the tip of a wick, is suddenly released all at once. It splashes across the floor, it seeps into the wood. Its surface area increases 1,000-fold in a fraction of a second. When the flame from the falling wick touches that pool of fuel, it doesn't just spread, it erupts. The liquid instantly vaporizes, creating a fine mist of highly flammable accelerant in the air. The result is not a gentle fire, it's a flashover, a sudden violent fireball that consumes all available oxygen. This was the bargain people made with the dark every single night. In exchange for light, they invited a small sleeping bomb into their homes. They lived with it so constantly that they forgot the danger. It was just a lamp. Until it wasn't. The mechanics are simple. The consequences are not. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. Perhaps he stood up too quickly, his old joints protesting. Perhaps he misjudged the distance to the table's edge in the dim light. Or perhaps it was just a simple, involuntary tremor in his 88-year-old hand. The cause is lost to history. The result is not. There was a dull clatter of metal on wood as the lamp's base was knocked. It tipped. It slid. It fell. For a fraction of a second, it seemed to hang in the air, a perfect self-contained system of glass and fire suspended in time. And then gravity took over. The sound was sharp and clean, the crack of the glass chimney breaking, followed by the deeper shatter of the font against the wooden floorboards. Then a wet, spreading sound, the slosh of the liberated kerosene. The falling wick, still lit, was a tiny, doomed meteor. It hit the growing pool of fuel. The room erupted. It wasn't a fire. It was a flash. A sudden, brilliant white-orange bloom of light that vaporized every shadow in the house for a single, silent instant. A wave of heat so intense it felt like a physical slap, a solid thing that knocked the air from his lungs. In that moment, he was not the legendary patriarch of the McCoy clan. He was not a warrior or a survivor. He was an old man, standing in the epicenter of a physics equation that had just been violently solved. His reaction time, slowed by age, was no match for the speed of chemistry. The fire didn't spread. It leapt. It found the old dry cotton of his trousers. It found the hem of his shirt. It didn't burn its way up his clothes. It climbed them, a predator finding purchase, enveloping him in a column of heat and light. For a long second, there was no sound at all, just the deep, hungry whoosh of the fire consuming the oxygen in the room, just the sight of a man, a legend, turned into a silhouette against a curtain of his own personal hell. The shock hit his nervous system like a jolt of electricity. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he was just a spectator to his own horror. And then, instinct took over. The old warrior instinct. Fight. Survive. His hands, the same hands that had once held a rifle with deadly certainty, began to beat at the flames. They were clumsy, frantic slaps against his own body. A desperate, rhythmic drumming of flesh against burning cloth. Thump, thump, thump. But it was useless. This wasn't an enemy you could punch. It wasn't a man you could grapple with. The fire was a liquid thing. It clung to him. Everywhere he slapped, it seemed to reappear somewhere else, angrier than before. It was a cruel mockery of a fight. How do you fight an enemy that is wearing your own clothes? How do you attack something that has already breached your final line of defense? The room became a vortex of motion and sound. His ragged, panicked gasps for air, the sharp crackle and hiss of the fire as it greedily consumed the fabric. The smell, the sickeningly sweet chemical odor of burning kerosene mixed with the acrid smoke of singed cotton. He stumbled, his 88-year-old legs struggling to keep him upright. He was engaged in a desperate, clumsy dance with death. He lurched towards the door, then back towards the center of the room, as if trying to outrun the fire that was attached to him. This was the ultimate indignity. This was a man who had faced down armed posses, who had stared into the eyes of his mortal enemies and not flinched. He had survived ambushes that should have killed him. He was a master of strategy, of angles, of knowing when to hold his ground and when to retreat. But none of that mattered now. All the cunning, all the courage, all the years of survival training were worthless. This wasn't a battle of wits or bravery. It was a battle of simple physics, and his frail, aging body was losing. The fire was faster, hotter, and more relentless than any Hatfield had ever been. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like a lifetime. And in that compressed, terrifying span of time, he must have realized a horrible truth. He was not going to win this fight. Not alone. The door to the room crashed open. For the grandson who burst in, the scene was a snapshot from a living nightmare. It wasn't just a fire. It was a room choked with a black, oily smoke that stung the eyes and stole the breath. And in the center of it, a silhouette of a man wreathed in an unnatural orange glow. There was no time for thought, only instinct. He grabbed the first thing he could find, a heavy wool blanket from a nearby bed. It was a primal, desperate act of rescue, a tactic as old as fire itself. He lunged forward, throwing the heavy fabric over his grandfather. The goal was simple, to starve the flames of oxygen, to suffocate the enemy. But Randall, disoriented and in agony, was still moving, still fighting. For a terrifying few seconds, they were wrestling, the grandson trying to wrap the blanket tighter while the old man thrashed beneath it, fighting the very person who was trying to save him. Others rushed in, drawn by the commotion. More hands helped to hold the blanket down, to press it against the heat, to smother every last pocket of air. The frantic crackling of the fire was replaced by a muffled hissing, then a series of weak, sputtering pops. And then, finally, an eerie silence fell, broken only by the sound of heavy, panicked breathing in the smoky dark. The flames were gone. They had won the battle against the fire, and for a fleeting, hopeful second, they believed they had saved the man. They pulled the heavy blanket away. The room was a wreck. A dark, wet stain of kerosene scarred the floorboards. The air was thick with the ghost of the fire, a smell that would never leave their memories. In the middle of it all, the old lion, the great survivor, had collapsed. He was no longer fighting. He was terrifyingly still. The fire on his clothes was out, but a new fire, a deeper one, was just beginning inside his body. The immediate crisis was over. The long, slow one was just beginning. There was no ambulance. There was no siren splitting the night. The journey to help was a slow, agonizing ride in a horse-drawn cart. The cold Kentucky air, a fresh torment on a body that was still radiating heat. Every jolt of the wooden wheels on the rutted road was a new wave of agony. The help they found was not a modern emergency room. It was likely a local doctor's office, a small room in a house smelling of carbolic acid and old paper. Under the dim, hissing light of a gas lamp, a doctor would have made his assessment, and he would have known almost immediately that this was a battle he was going to lose. To understand the hopelessness of the situation, you have to understand the science of a severe burn in 1914. The body is a fortress, and the skin is its outer wall. It keeps the vital fluids in and the world of bacteria and infection out. The fire had breached those walls, catastrophically. Today, a patient like Randall would be rushed to a specialized burn unit. He'd be given intravenous fluids to combat dehydration and shock. He'd receive powerful antibiotics to fight the inevitable raging infections. There would be skin grafts, sterile environments, a whole arsenal of 21st century medical technology. Randall had none of that. Penicillin was still more than a decade away from being discovered. The concept of fluid resuscitation for burn shock was in its infancy. The primary enemy after a major burn is not the burn itself. It's the opportunistic infection that comes after. And in 1914, they had no weapons to fight that enemy. The doctor did what he could. He would have gently cleaned the wounds, a process that must have been excruciating. He would have applied some kind of salve or dressing, perhaps a simple petroleum jelly or a now disproven folk remedy. Then, he would have wrapped the body in clean linen bandages. To us, this sounds like medieval medicine, because it essentially was. They were treating the symptom, the damaged skin, without any ability to treat the systemic collapse that was already underway inside his body. They were patching a crumbling fortress wall with paper. The pain was one thing, but as the physical shock set in, a different kind of trauma was beginning to surface. The body was shutting down, and the mind was starting to drift. As the long hours of the night wore on, the physical pain began to blur with a deeper, older pain. His body, ravaged by shock and dehydration, was starting to fail, and his mind, That fortress of memory and grief began to crumble. He drifted in and out of consciousness. The lines between 1914 and 1888 began to dissolve. In the fever dream of his delirium, the two fires merged into one. Was that the smell of burning kerosene in his small house? Or was it the smell of his family's cabin, the pine logs and winter provisions going up in a furious blaze? Was that his grandson's face leaning over him, his brow furrowed with worry? Or was it the face of his son Calvin, calling out to him in the smoke-filled darkness of New Year's night? The quiet, sterile room of the doctor's care blurred with the chaotic, snow-covered landscape of the massacre. He could hear the crackle of the fire, but was it the small fire on his clothes, or the roar of his entire life being reduced to ash? He was trapped in a feedback loop of trauma. The present was a perfect, cruel echo of the past. The physical sensations of the new burn were unlocking the stored terror of the old one. He might have called out names: Sarah, Alifair, Talbot, names of the dead. He was no longer in Pikeville, 1914. He was back in the heart of the feud, reliving the worst night of his life. But this time, there was no escape. There was no well to hide in. He was back in the burning house, and the house was his own body. This is the final cruelty of post-traumatic stress. The brain cannot tell the difference between a memory and a present reality. When triggered, it relives the event with the same intensity, the same flood of adrenaline, the same visceral terror. For 26 years, he had managed to keep that night locked away in a dark corner of his mind. But the fire of 1914 had found the key. It had kicked down the door and let the monster out. As he lay there, bandaged and broken, he wasn't just fighting a burn. He was fighting the ghosts of everyone he had ever lost. News in a small mountain town doesn't travel. It seeps. It moves like the morning mist from house to house, over back fences, across the counters of the general store. The story of Randall McCoy's accident started as a single, urgent knock on a neighbor's door in the dead of night. By sunrise, it was a murmur. By the time the church bells rang for Sunday service, it was a low roar. Imagine the scene. People gathering on the wooden sidewalks, their voices hushed. The milkman would hear it from a sleepy-eyed housewife. The blacksmith would hear it from the stable boy. The words would be passed in quick, clipped sentences, loaded with a history that everyone understood. Did you hear about old man McCoy? Fire. How bad? Bad. But underneath the surface-level questions of concern, a darker, more primitive question was bubbling up in everyone's mind. The question they didn't dare ask out loud, at least not at first. Was it really an accident? This was not just any old man who had a fall. This was Randall McCoy. A man with a list of enemies a mile long. A man whose entire life was a testament to the fact that violence could erupt at any time, for any reason. To the people of Pikeville, the name McCoy was synonymous with the name Hatfield. They were two sides of the same bloody coin. For decades, if a McCoy barn burned down, you assumed a Hatfield lit the match. If a Hatfield cousin was found shot, you looked for a McCoy with a new rifle. The feud was supposed to be over. It had been quiet for years, but deep-seated suspicions don't just vanish. They go dormant, like a virus in the blood, waiting for a trigger. And a fire at the McCoy house was a powerful trigger. The older folks, the ones who remembered the real fighting, would have been the most suspicious. They would have looked at each other with knowing eyes. Fire, they would have said, with a certain weight, a certain emphasis. Because to them, fire wasn't an accident. It was a weapon. It was a message. It was the Hatfield signature. As the hours ticked by, the great conspiracy theory that had gripped the town began to unravel. There were no reports of strangers on the road. No one had seen any suspicious figures crossing the tug fork from West Virginia. There were no triumphant boasts coming from the Hatfield hollows. There was only a grim, heavy silence. The official story, the one told by the grandson who was actually there, began to solidify. It wasn't a firebomb thrown through a window. It wasn't an assassination attempt. It was a lamp, a dropped lamp, a clumsy, tragic, utterly mundane accident. For the townspeople, this news was met with a strange mixture of relief and perhaps a subconscious tinge of disappointment. The grand, dark opera of the Hatfield-McCoy feud had conditioned them to expect violence, betrayal, and revenge. A final dramatic act. But this was just sad. There was no enemy to blame. There was no villain to curse. There was just an old man, a slippery hand, and a law of physics. The great Randall McCoy, the man who had survived a war and a blood feud, was brought down by the same kind of random, stupid luck that could claim a farmer, a shopkeeper, or a child. It was a profoundly unsatisfying ending to an epic story. It's like reading a book about a master swordsman who spends his life defeating dragons, only to have him die in the last chapter by choking on a fishbone. The realization that settled over Pikeville was a quiet one, but it was significant. This was the moment the Hatfield-McCoy feud officially died. It had been dormant for years, but this event was the final nail in the coffin. It proved that the old hatreds, the old scores, were no longer the most dangerous things in the mountains. The most dangerous things were now time, and gravity, and frailty. Devil Anse Hatfield, living out his own final years, likely heard the news and felt not a shred of victory, but perhaps a cold shiver of recognition. The mortality that had just claimed his old rival was coming for him too. They were just two old men waiting for their turn, their legendary war reduced to a footnote in the face of a much larger, more impartial enemy. It wasn't a Hatfield that got him. It wasn't a bullet. It was just life, in all its cruel and arbitrary messiness. He did not die that night. In a final, stubborn act of defiance that was pure Randall McCoy, he held on. For hours, for days. His body, a ruined landscape of burns and infection, refused to surrender. The same impossible toughness that had seen him through the war and the feud was now engaged in its last, unwinnable battle. The room where he lay would have been a place of hushed whispers and quiet footsteps. What was left of his family would have gathered, taking turns sitting by his bedside in a grim, silent vigil. They would have watched the slow, inexorable process of a body shutting down. The fever would have raged, a fire within a fire, as his system tried and failed to fight off the massive infection. His breathing would have become shallow, labored, each breath a small, painful victory. This period of waiting is its own special kind of hell. It is the liminal space between life and death. The fight is over. The outcome is certain. But the end has not yet arrived. It is a time for quiet reflection, for unspoken goodbyes. What did he think about in his final moments of lucidity? Did he see the faces of his lost sons waiting for him on the other side? Did he feel a sense of peace, a release from the long, hard burden of his life? Or did he feel the bitter sting of irony, the cosmic injustice of it all? We can only speculate. But it's hard to imagine there wasn't a part of him that was ready. He had outlived his wife. He had outlived most of his children. He had outlived his own legend. The world had moved on without him. Perhaps in a strange way, this final random act of violence was a release. The body gives up what the spirit has held on to for so long. The physical pain, the raging infection, the systemic shock, it all becomes too much. The fortress walls, breached and battered, finally crumble completely. The will to survive, the defining characteristic of his entire existence, was finally overwhelmed by the simple biological need to stop. It did not happen in a moment of drama. There was no final whispered message, no dramatic last gasp. It was much quieter than that. For those watching by his bedside, there was only a subtle shift in the rhythm of the room. The constant, ragged sound of his breathing, which had been the grim soundtrack to their vigil for days, simply stopped. There was a breath in, and then There was not another breath out. In the silence that followed, the weight of the moment settled. The fight was over. The long 88-year war that was Randolph McCoy's life had finally reached its armistice. The man on the bed was no longer a legend. He was no longer the patriarch of the McCoy clan, the survivor of the massacre, the ferryman on the tug fork. He was just a body, finally at peace, released from a lifetime of pain, both physical and psychological. In a life filled with the deafening noise of gunfire, of shouting, of burning wood and splintering doors, his death was the quietest thing that had ever happened to him. It was a silence so profound it seemed to absorb all the sound that had come before it. The family in the room would have looked at one another, a silent confirmation passing between them. The long watch was over. The tension that had held them captive for days finally broke, replaced by the heavy, leaden finality of grief. The old lion was gone. The unkillable ghost of the mountains had finally given up the ghost. He hadn't been defeated by a Hatfield. He hadn't been outsmarted by an enemy. He had simply worn out. He had reached the end of a very long, very hard road. And with that final silent breath, an entire era of Appalachian history came to a definitive, quiet close. The funeral of Randolph McCoy was not a grand state affair. There were no marching bands or 21-gun salutes. It was a simple, mountain affair, marked by a quiet dignity that belied the violent chaos of his life. He was buried in the Dils cemetery in Pikeville, a peaceful spot on a hillside overlooking the town. From his grave, you can almost see the river where he worked as a ferryman, the silent witness to his final years. Imagine the gathering, a collection of weathered faces, dressed in their Sunday best, his surviving children and grandchildren, their faces etched with a grief that was both personal and historical. Neighbors and townspeople who had known him only as the quiet, bearded old man from the ferry. They came to pay their respects not just to a man, but to a monument. What must the preacher have said? How do you eulogize a man like Randall McCoy? Do you talk about the farmer, the soldier, the father? Or do you talk about the feud, the killings, the burning cabin? How do you reconcile the quiet, frail man they were burying with the vengeful, violent figure of the legends? The truth is, they were burying both. They were laying to rest the last, living connection to the bloodiest chapter in their community's history. His death was a punctuation mark, the final, definitive end to a story that had haunted those hills for a generation. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the cold Kentucky earth, a palpable sense of an era's end must have settled over the mourners. The great feud, the defining myth of their region, had now officially passed from living memory into the realm of history. They shoveled the dirt over the casket, each thud a final hollow drumbeat in a long, drawn-out war. They were burying a man. But they knew even then that you can't bury a story. The story was just beginning its new life. It was escaping the confines of Randall's pained memory and becoming something else entirely, a piece of American folklore. The news of his death rippled out from Pikeville, carried by the telegraph wire. It appeared in small columns in newspapers across Kentucky and then across the country. The headlines were stark and to the point. Randolph McCoy is dead, one might read. Patriarch of famous feud, family succumbs to burns. The articles themselves were short, often just a few paragraphs. They were written in the detached, journalistic prose of the era. They dutifully reported the facts. His age, 88. The cause of death, complications from burns. The date and place of the accident. But in between the lines of these factual reports, you can see the myth being polished. They all referred to him not as a ferryman or a farmer, but as the leader of the McCoy clan. They all made immediate dramatic reference to the famous Hatfield-McCoy feud. To the rest of America, reading these small notices over their morning coffee, Randall McCoy wasn't a real person. He was a character, He was a symbol of a bygone era of frontier justice, a relic from a wilder, more violent time that was rapidly fading into the past. The articles would briefly recount the highlights of the feud: the stolen pig, the star-crossed lovers, the New Year's night massacre. It was a story that had already been simplified for mass consumption. The rough edges of poverty, politics, and post-war trauma sanded down to a simple narrative of two warring families. And his death? It was presented as the final bizarre chapter in this epic tale. The articles would all mention the strange irony of it. The man who had faced down 100 guns, brought low by a simple lamp. It was a perfect, tragic ending that seemed almost too literary to be true. What these articles missed, of course, was the human reality. They didn't capture the smell of the smoke, the quiet desperation of his last days, or the profound loneliness of a man who had outlived his own world. They reported the event, but they couldn't convey the weight. The newspaper reports were the first draft of the history, and in them, the frail, suffering old man was already being replaced by the monumental, tragic figure of legend. When you step back and look at the life of Randolph McCoy, it is impossible to ignore the cruel, almost symmetrical irony of how it ended. Think about the sheer volume of violence this man walked through. He survived the mechanized slaughter of the American Civil War, a conflict that wiped out an entire generation of young men. He survived decades of the most vicious blood feud in American history. He walked through storms of lead that felled his brothers, his sons, and his friends. He outwitted bounty hunters and survived midnight ambushes. He was a man who seemed impervious to the weapons of his enemies. Bullets literally missed him, and yet his undoing wasn't a masterstroke of a rival. It wasn't a glorious last stand on a misty mountain pass. It was a mundane household object, a 5-cent glass lamp, an uncoordinated step. But the irony goes even deeper. It is the specific element of his death that feels so heavy. Fire. In 1888, the Hatfields used fire to flush his family out into the cold, turning his home into a trap and destroying everything he held dear. He survived that fire. He carried the trauma of it for 26 years. And in the end, it was fire that came back to finish the job. It is as if the universe had a specific weapon reserved for him, and having missed the first time, it simply waited patiently for another opportunity. There is a terrifying lesson buried in this tragedy. We spend so much of our lives guarding against the big threats. We build walls. We lock doors. We look over our shoulders for the enemies we can name. Randall McCoy spent his life doing just that. He guarded the perimeter of his life with a rifle and a fierce paranoia. But the thing that gets you usually isn't the monster at the gate. It's the loose rug on the stairs. It's the failing brake line. It's the spilled lamp. Randall McCoy mastered the art of surviving the extraordinary. But in the end, he was defeated by the ordinary. He survived the grand drama of history, only to succumb to the indifferent laws of chance. The story of Randall McCoy is, at its heart, a story about the long shadow of trauma. The violence of the feud didn't end when the shooting stopped in the 1890s. It continued to claim victims for decades, in quieter, more insidious ways. It claimed Randall not with a bullet, but by trapping him in a past he could never escape, leaving him a lonely, haunted figure in a world that no longer made sense. His death by fire was not an act of the feud, but it was its final echo. It was the last, tragic chapter in a story that was written entirely in blood and ash. The feud never really ended for him. It only ended when he did. His gravestone in the Dils cemetery is a simple modern one, placed there by his descendants. It lists his name, his dates, and his service in the Confederate Army. And at the bottom it reads, "Husband of Sarah McCoy," a simple human identifier for a man whose life was anything but simple. But looking at the whole violent arc of his existence, you're left with a difficult question. We have this romantic idea that a warrior, a survivor, should die a warrior's death, a final blaze of glory, a last stand, something that validates the violent life they lived. Randall didn't get that. He got a quiet, pathetic, and agonizingly domestic end. But perhaps, in a strange way, that was a mercy. He died not as a soldier in an endless war, but as an old man in his home, surrounded by what was left of his family. His end wasn't glorious, but it was, for the first time in a long time, his own. It wasn't dictated by the Hatfields, it was dictated by chance. So what is a better end for a man like Randall McCoy? Is it better to die on your feet, rifle in hand, continuing the cycle of violence that destroyed your family? Or is it better to survive long enough to see the peace, even if it means enduring the quiet indignity of old age and the cruel randomness of a household accident? There is no easy answer, but his story forces us to confront the brutal truth that sometimes, for the great survivors of history, the hardest part isn't the war, it's the peace that comes after.